So what's going on, guys?
I got laid off because of Trump's tariffs, so I'm looking for a job.
So it's just the fact that the costs
yes, I've noticed that on the shelves, some of the costs were getting like $3 to $4 higher on some of the smaller commodities.
This is kind of that. Well, it goes back to Hazlitt's economics in one lesson. Trump says, okay, if we put on tariffs on steel and aluminum, then we'll create a lot of jobs in that sector. Well, he's absolutely right. That happened because now more people are buying it instead of buying imported steel, which was cheaper. But, and this was a few weeks ago on the podcast, I think we covered this, for every job created in the steel and aluminum sectors, that job came at the cost of, I believe, 16 jobs elsewhere in the economy.
Well, the company that I was working at mostly dealt with agriculture, actually, and that's not even been uncontroversial that sector of the economy has taken a pretty big hit with Trump's tariffs. The government was planning on subsidizing farmers to the tune of $12 billion because they were losing so much money.
Wow. I kind of know about farm subsidies in this area because you have, I call them weed farmers, where there's just weeds growing and every now and then they till them down or something, or you have people who, grow ryegrass or something and then bale it up for hay, but just leave the bales and it ends up with the ivy going through them. They're doing it to get the subsidies. They're not doing it because they're actually making a living farming. I guess one thing that we might want to talk about that I haven't talked about is the whole Alex Jones thing. But people probably, it's no secret how much I really don't like Alex Jones. I kind of think that listening to Alex Jones is a bit like listening to 10,000 fingernails being scraped against a blackboard that was itself being scraped against another blackboard. But
do you think Alex Jones is going to be like a slippery slope thing or more?
Oh yeah, that's the whole point of it, because because he is so unpopular with a lot of people, no one really kind of wants to stick their neck out like will defend Alex Jones, where when you'd be defending freedom of speech. And this is the way it's always gone. The first one they go after, it was like at the DMCA, the first one they went after was Eric Corley, who was the editor of 2600 Magazine, which is a magazine about computer hacking. And so they say, okay, well, this guy's this notorious computer hacker, there's a terrible person. And so not a lot of people wanted to come to his defense. But of course, we see today with the DMCA how it's a tool for bullying and censorship. And that's what they do. The first time they do it, they go after someone that not a lot of people are going to want to hitch up their horse to, because they don't want to see, they want to be seen as, being allied with Alex Jones or anything like that. And it just makes it, it just has a precedent to do it to someone else.
I think even on that, they chose a really strategically bad target, because Alex Jones, his YouTube channel had 2 million subscribers. I mean, yeah, no one really wanted to ally with him, but he had a really large following. It's not. And
I did notice that right after that happened, not only in the Google Trends, not only did searches for Alex Jones and Infowars go up, but searches for BitChute went up as well. So there's the Streisand effect again.
Didn't he gain a ton of viewers as well?
I don't know about that.
He did. He gained I forget the exact number. I think it was he gained somewhere around 200,000 new subscribers, which probably got him a lot of revenue. Are you interested at all in the Internet Bill of Rights angle that people have been trying to push for in response to this? I personally don't think that it's about social media companies trying to censor political opponents. I think that that's a part of it, but I think ultimately that what's motivating these social media companies is to try and give the FCC control of the internet by classifying social media companies as public utilities, which would allow the government to de facto nationalize the internet.
Yeah, we kind of went through that with the net neutrality thing.
They would essentially, it would have the government censor content which it deemed based on a scale of arbitrary fairness.
So they're actually talking about bringing back the fairness doctrine.
Yes, it is the
Look
fairness
that up,
doctrine.
people. That was a horrible thing. Although there was something that you said a little earlier that's kind of the rhetoric going around, and I think is big misunderstanding of what's going on. Like they're going after political opponents. I don't think that's it at all. I said this about the DMCA, and I was right about that, so I think I'm going to be right about this too. They're starting off going after conservatives and libertarians and people like that. When they're done with that, they're going to go after the people on their side. They're going to go after the Young Turks. They're going to go after David Pakman. They're going to go after Kyle Kulinski. This is not about silencing political opposition. It's about stopping competition to the big media companies.
Well, exactly.
So it's just all part of it. And when you start noticing that, it's like, wait a minute, why does it keep going against what they want? Well, it's going against what they say they want. If you look at what really happened and assume it was intentional and then try to define their goals from there, I think you'll usually find it pretty enlightening. How you doing, Charlie?
Just fine. Just I was going to join earlier, but I was eating, and then I took a little power nap, and I'm like, oh crap, I didn't want to miss this. So once again, I look at what he has done. What he has been talking about, doing all these type of things. I'm sitting here and I'm like, you know what? He made it. He made his own bed for the longest time. He has sat there. He has done all these type of you know what I mean, right? He just he's been doing all this type of grandiose stuff, and eventually that stuff comes piling. It's not. I don't think it's conspiracy stuff as much as it is the globalists or anything like that. That's gonna get him taken out. I'm like, that's what I'm like. No,
they're turning the frogs gay.
Yes, I don't believe in that type of, going all in. But it is a bit troubling. And people say, "Oh, he's kicking the butt of CNN, CNN and all the major news networks." That's why I'm like, I don't think that's either, because he's been, if you look at the view traffic, the traffic has been going down on Alex Jones, and no one's been really watching him.
Well, until they banned him, as I pointed out earlier, if you look at Google Trends, right after the ban, it shot up.
Again, the Streisand effect. It's just, no one seems to remember how it works.
I'm also doing a collab with Atomic ANCAP on that recent Truediltom video, which people were spamming in your Discord the other day.
Yeah, I really don't want to wade into those waters again. No, his followers are just horrible. God, weeks of just continued.
Oh, you should see where he came out unironically as a national Bolshevik.
What the heck is that? Should I even know what that is?
It's basically, it's a meme ideology essentially, but there are people on the far left who they've embraced Nazism, but instead of wanting to establish a socialist government, they want to actually go full communist. So they're like nationalist communists, basically. It's really cringy, but yeah.
Nabos?
Yeah,
instead of Nazis, Nabos.
Nazbols. But Truediltom came out as an unironic Nazbol on Twitter like a week ago. In response to the Internet Bill of Rights, Truediltom went on James Alsop. You've seen that guy from Australia. And he went on there describing, like, he used to apparently identify as a libertarian, which he did. If you go back and watch his earlier videos, he'd do work with that guy T when he was a libertarian. And he described it as if he didn't ever understand what libertarianism was to begin with. He said that as a libertarian, he would just go around constantly screeching about the non-aggression principle, never explaining what it was. That's another thing that I thought was very peculiar, is that he used the statist strawman of the non-aggression principle, which is, one, that it's like a law that people are compelled to follow, and two, that there's no actual explanatory power backing it. Like he completely omitted deontological reasoning, like as if it didn't even exist.
But that's just silly.
Yeah, it's one of those things where they remind me of the creationists, because you get a creationist who says, well, I used to be an evolutionist until I realized, and then he starts talking about these movies like, you never understood the first thing about biological evolution.
Yeah, I've had that happen to me a lot, with people coming up and claiming to be a former ANCAP, and then I like ask them about it, and it's very obvious they never understood it to begin with. Somebody came up to me who was like an anarcho-syndicalist back when I was on Twitter, claiming to be a former ANCAP, and they said that they stopped being an ANCAP because they realized the ethical problems with owning child sex slaves.
Wait, what?
And they weren't joking either. They were actually trying to have an argument with me.
That makes no sense. I don't know any
kind of slavery is ridiculous when you're trying to apply it to a philosophy that believes fundamentally in self-ownership.
Nowadays, anyone can be called it. There's pretty much, if you have an ANCO, there's always some type of gimmick behind it. Or we have ANCAPs and communists, and I mean, heck, I still can't believe there's anarcho-pacifist. I don't know how that even works. I mean, I can understand. I respect pacifism, but sometimes, you know, you have to defend yourself.
Well, ANPACs believe in something called the non-violence principle, which is essentially just the non-aggression principle, except it only applies to direct confrontational violence. So you can only actually be justified in using force if somebody is initiating violence against you. That's why ANPACs aren't explicitly capitalist, because you'd have to read Tolstoy to understand it. Tolstoy was also somewhat utopian in his thinking.
But it's like people misunderstand the pacifism of people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King. The reason why they went through their platform of nonviolence was because they knew there was no way that their government would allow them to be armed. And so if they tried finding them through violence, they knew it wouldn't work. So they went the other direction.
That's true. Then again, Malcolm X, you know, he was said something like that, but he said always defend oneself. So, you know.
Well, that's what, I've got a video on this, but that's pretty much what drove the civil rights movement, was Black people arming themselves. And there's a story about one reporter. He was over at Dr. King's house and he was about to sit down, and someone else had to warn him he was about to sit on a couple of guns. Yeah. But it was when Dr. King tried to go and get a concealed carry permit. I forget which state it was, but he had met every single requirement for a concealed carry permit, except for the unwritten one about how you can't be Black. You know, so that was the point where he said, "Okay, no, we're not going to be able to do this through violent resistance or through defending ourselves. We're going to have to do it through nonviolence." It's not about specifically being armed with firearms. It's about being able to use whatever weapons you have that are at your disposal. And they had very effective weapons in that, because, you know, they could make all of the injustices against them be very visible and get the sympathy of the people and really expose, you know, the character of those who are oppressing them.
And yet that's the thing. People just seem to fall into that, especially in the United States and such. We fall into the binary of like good and evil, which party's good, which party's evil. But you really have to look more. It's like, yeah, this party right here, both of them pretty much at the end of the day serve, well, oligarchs and all the stuff, because you know they serve them, not the people. And that's the real sad truth is just that you can't really, you know, you could just hear all the nice little flowery stuff. And I mean, hey, if you want to make change in Congress and such, which I am fully support, and such, but it is the most hardest thing to do, because you might be one or maybe have a group, but at the end of the day, the people who actually have real power are the ones that get those are the corporations, those are the people who want the, you know, who use the.
Well, it's like, how often do you write your congressman? You know, once a month, once a week. Even if you write them every single day, every time they step out of the door, they're accosted by all sorts of, you know, lobbyists from all these different corporations who can hire professional lobbyists to be in Washington 24/7.
You know, you could think that these good politicians exist, but the fact of the matter is that the government, by its sole function, it exists to it has to steal people from people to exist, and it has to impose its will onto people, which nobody actually ever consented to in order to exist. And then there's also all the ethical problems with throwing people in jail for nonviolent crimes, which is akin to a politician throwing people in jail for violating something which they think they shouldn't do in their opinion. Point is that you can't be a politician without either not listening to your conscience or just not having a conscience, because if you had a conscience in politics, you'd be out of there really quick.
Yeah.
This is why I think Count Dankula is taking the right approach by saying, look, what you are doing to me is not justice. It's not something government has any legitimacy doing. I will not pay your fine. You know, if you grab me and throw me in jail, oh well, but I just won't pay the fine. And you know, him being visible like that should, you know, get a lot of attention for that. And I think it was Shoe on Head on Twitter who told him, well, you know, why don't you just pay the fine and then you can continue, you know, you'll be free to speak out against it. And I don't really think she gets the idea. Him being in prison and him willing to go through that to stand up for what he believes in is a very powerful message. Yeah, and I don't know if you've seen the video where he read out the joke of a response that the court gave to his appeal, but I mean, it's basically everything Orwell wrote about. They like stopped just short of threatening to hold his lawyer in contempt for defending him. That's how bad it was.
Man, I did read that. And something I've noticed about the UK's laws in particular is just how arbitrary and subjective the way they're all defined, pretty much. It is how it's all extremely arbitrary. Hate speech, disturbing the peace. Like, what do these things even mean?
Well, it's like a lot of people are saying it was a big victory several years ago because they finally, at long last, repealed the laws against heresy. And okay, that's a good thing, but there are so many other just vague laws on the books, not even just about, you know, hate speech like a lot of countries have, but even just things that are just so vaguely worded about things you can say and things you cannot say, that if someone just doesn't like it, if they can still get you for heresy, they can't get you under that law, but there's plenty of others they can.
But if you actually look at how totalitarianism works, if you look at countries like North Korea with the least political freedom, or the UK, totalitarianism comes into existence through subjective laws like disturbing the peace or anti-hate speech policy. They don't say, hey, you can't speak anymore. We're not going to let you have freedom of speech anymore. No, what they'll tell you is you can't say that because that's hateful, or you can't protest for this cause because it's disturbing the peace.
But I mean, with the vague laws, it even lets you just be completely arbitrary, no matter how inconsistent you're being. If you're just a guy who runs a bake shop, you don't have the right to refuse to bake a cake for a gay couple because all that has to be protected and you have to serve the public. But if you're a big social media company who's taken, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies from the government, and you kick a conservative off your site, well, you know, they're a business. They can, you know, do what they want with their own business. It's like, wait a minute.
That's the problem with these double speak terms like fairness or disturbing the peace. Like, I don't know why I keep coming back to that, but I do. The problem with them is that they could mean anything to anybody, and that's by design, because they're also designed to be very fluffy, comfortable words which people project their own definitions of what they think it means, which results in these policies getting almost universal support.
My 2 cents in the chat. Everyone go check out his channel.
Yeah, FNet. I forgot to mention FNet. We're making some progress on that. We're at the point where the programmers are essentially trying to find what would be the best code. Like, we're no longer looking for members. I mean, if anyone wants to join the FNet project, then you can. But yeah, we're not looking for programmers anymore. We're actually onto the stage where we're starting to create code.
Yeah, I've been trying to get my thoughts together on it, but I mean, there's some things like I wanted to point out, like there are other projects like I2P, which can actually give you a private network layer for things around. And then there's something else, I forget what it is, but it's instead of http:// it will be something else://. But the idea is that instead of having a web server where it's from, it would all be stored by like on a whole bunch of different people's computers via BitTorrent. And so what I think you might want to do is just try to see if you can link up with other projects like that instead of trying to reinvent the wheel.
We're basing our model off of SNet, which is a meshnet protocol that operates in Cuba, which people use to avoid the Cuban government's ban on private internet connections.
Yeah, that would take care of like the issue with ISPs down on the physical and data link layers, but you'd still be hooking up to the rest of the internet unless you have something else going on the upper layers, and that's where I think a lot of those other projects would be if you integrated with those, that would be a better thing than trying to reinvent the wheel on all of that and trying to go through the whole OSI model and just trying to redo everything from scratch and just try and pull together, as many different, support as many of those existing projects as you can, because they all need support, and if you've got programmers willing to work on it and try to integrate with them, then, all of these different projects could benefit from it. I'll have to look up and see what that other is. I think Dave Cullen talked about that in a recent video, the replacement for HTTP.
One of the programmers, the developers for the HTTP protocol, stepped forward not too long ago, it was like a year or two ago, saying that HTTP is horribly outdated.
Yeah, I mean, you look at, say, what's happening with BitChute. For a while, people were worried about, but now it has like over 36% of it is funded, and not only that, but it's continuing to grow. Last time I checked, before I looked at 36, it was I believe like it was 20, then it went up to 30. It kept continuing to grow.
When I created my BitChute account like a month ago, it was at 19% funding. So the Alex Jones things has definitely helped them out quite a bit.
Right? That project, that's the one I was looking for. And instead of like, it would be a website, but instead of like https:// you do dat:// and it would just be decentralized over peer-to-peer. So no government could shut down your website because there's no server to shut down. I'll get a link to all of these.
Well, that's essentially what FNet's trying to do. Which
what's that decentralized marketplace? There's one that's actually out there and it's up and operational. I'll have to dig up the name of that one too.
Currently? That would be interesting.
Open Bazaar, that's the name of it.
Okay. I love those introduction videos, like those how to use the internet back when the internet was new. Have you seen those? Like
yes.
In the early 90s when Netscape was the thing.
Oh, this is actually pretty cool. It's like 2 years before, I think, Tim Berners-Lee invented the web. Douglas Adams, the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, he made a documentary with Tom Baker about what the future of interactivity was going to be like. And he basically predicted the entire World Wide Web. The look and feel was different, but conceptually, everything was there. It's kind of like how lots of people invented the light bulb around the same time, and Thomas Edison was just the first one to make it to the patent office. But it's just like there comes a point a lot of times where it's just the right time for an invention, and so lots of people invent it.
Well, that's something that I've noticed. It's not just my circle. If you go around all over social media, there's a very clear demand for decentralization of just of everything: the economy, the internet, manufacturing. So I'll
tell you the biggest thing that's missing, because you mentioned you were basing your mesh network off of that one in Cuba, and I've mentioned I2P and DAT as other things. You know, I2P can get you a replacement for IP and routing packets over the internet. DAT gets you a replacement for HTTP. But and this is really about the only thing that it's just fundamentally centralized, which is the DNS system. Whereas if you have, like, you know, Google.com or whatever, there's a system that translates that into the IP address. And all of that is essentially controlled from a single entity, and that's how governments are able to, like, do a lot of this censorship. Even if they can't take down the server, they can go to the DNS providers and say, hey, you know, remove, you know, this URL. You know, they've tried doing that with, like, the Pirate Bay several times, and then they come up with a different one. But, you know, they can still go to that one place. And we don't really have a good decentralized alternative. They tried one with Namecoin, and that was a good attempt, but it was just so fundamentally flawed in a lot of ways. It was just really prone to things like hijacking and cyber squatting, and, you know, stuff they've pretty much solved with DNS. So I think that's really the one missing part, is we need a good decentralized replacement for DNS.
Well, I'm sure there is an alternative. Just I and the people I'm working with have no idea where to even begin with approaching that. But no, I'm sure that there's a way, and the answer will come around pretty soon.
And it looks like Squirrel is getting close to launch, which will completely eliminate the need for usernames and passwords and any sort of identifying information on any website. And the protocol itself is pretty much finished, but Steve Gibson, the guy behind the project, is setting up a forum for it. And of course, you know, if you say, okay, well, Squirrel, if you want to try it, here's some test sites you can play around with. But the actual forum itself, if you say use a password, no, we got to get Squirrel working on the forum itself. Otherwise, people are going to go, what? So he'll get that working, and then I think it'll be the official launch, and then we'll have some work left to do with the documentation. But I'm really excited about that. That's been 5 years coming, but I think it's been time well spent.
You haven't, at least I haven't heard you. I think you mentioned it on one of your Bogosity podcasts, but I haven't really heard you talking about Cody Wilson lately. And I think that people severely underestimate the victory that is for crypto anarchism over the state. This is something as sentimental to political debate as gun rights, and now the gun rights debate doesn't exist anymore because it's been the ability for the state to regulate that industry has been innovated out of existence.
Well, it's kind of always been that case. We've got that sticky over on the Bogosity forum, the black market for firearms. All it takes is like $5,000 worth of machinist equipment, and if you have the plans, then you can do it. And I mean, anyone could set up that kind of black market operation, you know, in their garage or whatever. And I made a gun control video with Hoodie Demon about it, and he was saying, yeah, take it from me, you know, I've lived in trailer parks. The meth labs they set up there are really sophisticated. This is a lot simpler. So if they ever tried to make guns illegal, there'd be people setting up, you know, these things all over the place. And I think really what 3D printing of guns did has taken it to where you don't even need to be a skilled laborer to do it. You don't need to be a machinist or anything. You just need the right equipment, the 3D, you really need a 3D printer capable of printing metal is what you need, because there's videos of the Liberator, people print them out of the plastic, and then they fire them safely like they're hidden in a bunker or something, firing remotely, but the gun just blows apart into little pieces.
Yeah, well, we have 3D printers that can print metal already. It's a substance called Metal X.
Yeah.
The problem is that it's pretty early in, like, no, they're on the market. It's just they haven't been on the market very long. So they're really expensive,
and the extruded metal you need to run through them is expensive too. So.
Yeah. So but that's what I mean is 3D printing. Plastic 3D printing was about the same cost about 5 to 6 years ago as Metal X is currently. So
it's like when laser printers first came out, the first ones were like $50,000 or something like that, and only printed in black and white. I got a color laser printer sitting on the other side of my office,
Especially just considering how much more utility Metal X has. I mean, you can create spare car parts with it. There's a lot of things you can do with it you can't do with the plastic printer. And
I was talking to my car mechanic like 3 or 4 years about, and he said, yeah, that's one of the things he was really wanting to do is save up for one of those printers, because they really try and monopolize those car parts and make them as expensive as they possibly can. And he says, yeah, if I have one of those printers and people are sharing the plans for these car parts over the internet and I can just print it out and use it, I don't even have to wait to have it shipped.
Well,
and that's one other time, this was like 3 or 4 years ago, I think. It was one guy who had said that he had lost his tooth or something like that, but he had gone to the dentist, and he says, okay, well, we'll 3D print you a tooth and it'll take about 2 hours. And he was like, really? You can 3D print me a new tooth in 2 hours? He said, no, we can 3D print you a new tooth in 20 minutes. The whole procedure will take 2 hours. So wow, this is amazing, the stuff they're doing.
Yeah, great technology with these 3D printers and such is amazing.
And I think even with the Liberator, the idea was that you used a metal tube for the barrel, and then you had a nail for the firing pin, and then you still had to make, still had to like put a bunch of washers in it or something in order to make it comply with the federal laws about showing up in metal detectors. But I mean, if you can print a metal gun, that's a different thing. But I think mostly what people are doing is they're printing like AR-15 lowers or just something modular like that they can get the rest of the parts for and kind of build it around it.
Yeah, even if it didn't have any metal parts, I mean, you got the bullets. I don't know how that...
It doesn't do much good without the bullets, and they definitely show up.
Yeah. Every time I hear Trump talking about tariffs, he uses the term free trade, and the reason he uses the term free trade, or at least seemingly, is so that they can try and say, well, we need it to be fair, and if it's not fair, then it's not free, which
it usually ends up being the opposite. The more fair you try to make something, the less free you make it.
Well, that's the point, is that...
there was a great episode of Red Dwarf about that, because they had a prison where it took place inside the justice field, where there was pure justice and everything was fair, in the form of anytime you tried to commit an act of aggression or some other kind of act against someone else, the consequences happened to you instead. So if you tried to set your bunkies bed sheets on fire, your jacket caught on fire, if you punched a guy in the face, then you got the effects of the punch and things like that. It was hilarious. But yeah, that was the point. They made a system of pure and total fairness and justice, but there was no free will.
Right. Well, you just straight up can't do that. You can't try and use a monopoly on violence to attempt to make everything fair in society, because there are only a few things that the government can do. The government can, well, coerce people, and it can redistribute assets that it steals. So anything that it can give would not actually be fair. It's always either imposing its will onto people, or it's giving people economic privileges at the direct expense of others, of the people who actually produced the commodities.
But I mean, I think Milton Friedman made this point pretty well. Capitalism is not pro-business, it's pro-consumer. You know, the pro-business stuff actually tends to be anti-capitalist because it's all about picking winners and losers and giving some businesses an unfair advantage over others and things like that.
Yeah, I sort of see that perspective, but I don't think a free association-based society would necessarily adhere to any economic principles, because free association necessarily, well, implies that people would be free to associate in any manner that they like. So,
but I think Friedman's point was that in a free market, the whole purpose of a business is to serve the consumer and to make their lives better in some way, because that's the only way you can convince them to give you money.
Oh, you're talking about the economic side of a market, not the ethical side. Okay. Yeah, I get your point, and I'm not disagreeing with you.
Yeah, I love the way he had a lot of times of just completely turning the conversation around like that.
These statist fallacies, it's just profoundly Orwellian. My least favorite example would be when politicians refer to themselves as civil servants. You've heard that one before? I'm sure you have.
Oh, I love that one, yeah.
Yeah, well...
Or public servants. Or yeah.
That conveys a self-contradictory message that you can both be ruled by somebody, as in you're forced to associate with them and abide by the rules they put in place, but at the same time, they can somehow serve you as if that you have dominion over them and you can tell them what to do. And that's a self-contradictory position.
Yeah, you can't be the slave and the master at the same time. Well, this is one of the things I can't stand about the Law and Order shows, because at the start, you know, they have that voiceover from the guy who's been smoking way too many cigarettes saying, you know, the people are represented in court by blah, blah, blah. The people are not represented by prosecutors. Prosecutors represent the government. The people in a courtroom who represent the people are the jury. They're the representatives of the people, because if you want to put someone in jail, you got to run it by the people first. You got to run it by people who aren't a part of any governmental branch.
Right.
But I mean, they claim to be, oh, we represent the people, and the case is people versus this or whatever.
Oh, have you read some of the articles which were written at the time defending slavery in the South? Because here's another interesting thing that I found while researching the topic. I've noticed that the justification for slavery had a very strongly anti-capitalist leaning to their arguments. I'll put a link in the side chat here to an article written. It was an editorial written by George Fitzhugh in 1857 called "The Blessings of Slavery," and just to cite a random quote out of this: "We must confess that overstock the world as you will, with comforts and with luxuries, we do not see how to make capital relax its monopoly, how to do aught but tantalize the hireling. Capital, irresponsible capital begets and will I mean, it doesn't even sound like an article arguing for slavery. It sounds like something you'd expect to read out of Karl Marx. It's
and then there are some other justifications that are kind of remind you of some of the progressive rhetoric today, like how, you know, the slaves aren't really capable of taking care of themselves, so it's good that we're able to keep them, you know, enslaved, so they'll have work and they'll have, you know, a place to live and food to eat and stuff like that, and they won't starve. And it kind of reminds me of all this stuff about how, oh, you know, we need affirmative action and we need reparations, and because, you know, they're too poor and helpless to do it for themselves. They don't put it that way, of course, but that's the clear implication.
That's an argument that sort of implies eugenicism, that these people are inferior, and that if they weren't enslaved, then they wouldn't be able to make it in society, and they would just they would just be a burden on society as we know it. Yeah, that's a eugenicist argument.
Yeah, I think Thomas Jefferson had the perfect response for that. If you look at Jefferson's opinion over his life in the letters he wrote, he started off just not really knowing, but just going from appearances, it seems like, blacks aren't that bright. And then other people were saying, well, maybe that's just because they haven't had the same opportunities for early education. And he slowly became convinced over time that, yeah, okay, that does seem right. And maybe if we give them equality. But there was one point, I think it was kind of in the middle, where he was starting to be convinced of that. But he said, really, the thing is, it doesn't matter. Isaac Newton was smarter than any of us. Would that give him the right to rule over us and force us to work for him? Yeah, so if he saw the question is actually irrelevant to the justifications for slavery.
We're seeing sort of like a resurgence of that sort of mentality today with race realism. That's such a hot button topic, but no, if you actually look
the term race realism,
yeah, it's very reminiscent of like other pseudoscientific movements.
When is any group that have styled themselves realists ever actually, been actual realists, like trying to make their opinions match reality? It's kind of like,
yeah, I can't. Like, I know there are some more absurd examples. I just can't think of them off the top of my head. Like, wasn't there for a time, like, the flat earthers calling themselves gravity realists? I heard something like that from one of those circles, and I thought it was the most hilarious thing I'd ever heard.
Yeah, well, I mean, even in non-political movements, there was a realist movement in art in, like, the late 19th century, and what they were doing was portraying the world as it really was. But of course, everyone in all their paintings was just completely miserable. And it's like, well, that's not realism. That's just the opposite extreme from, what they were complaining about.
Romanticism.
Yeah. And Rococo and things like that.
Yeah. Well, the main problem with race realism is, yeah, they aren't looking at the factors in history. Like if you look from 1890 to 1930, the black middle class was more likely to succeed than the white middle class in the United States.
Going back to the chat, Angry Froman says, I find race realists funny when they explain why white people have high IQs than black people, but when Jews are, by their own understanding, Jews are higher and they don't know why.
Yeah, that's another very glaring problem that I've noticed with race realism is that by their own admission, if they're going to use the bell curve, there are groups which would be superior to white people. There would be like Asians and Jews. I mean, you don't hear a lot of ranting about Asians, but you hear them, like the race realists tend to be alt-righters, so they're not too fond of Jews. Are they saying that Jews are superior to white people?
Well, I mean, they seem to be complaining that the Jews are taking over everything, but then they say they're smarter than black people, so they should rule it. So, yeah, it's not consistent. It's funny how you never see racists who think that it's a race other than theirs that should be in charge. And thanks to everyone else who participated, and thanks to all my supporters, and of course, thank you for viewing. Until next time, stay strong and be free.